Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Nick Armstrong, a research fellow with the Institute for National Security and Counterterrorism. This event is part of INSCIT's ongoing Everett Post-Conflict Reconstruction Speaker Series, a series that enhances our certificate programs by bringing in subject matter experts to speak on a range of topics related to the difficult challenges facing transitional and post-conflict societies. Today's discussion is on the advisory mission in Afghanistan. The topic is certainly a timely and important one, especially to those of us who have some skin in the game, not least of which several of our Afghan colleagues here at Maxwell, those of us who are serving, have served, or have family or friends working in Afghanistan. While the U.S. has a long-term strategic interest in denying al-Qaeda any opportunity for respite or renewal in the region, the NATO mission is clear, and that is to support the Afghan government's ability to convince its people that it can provide them a better future than the Taliban alternative. Over the past 2 years, NATO and Afghan forces have made remarkable gains in reversing the Taliban's resurgence in places like Kandahar and Helmand, and also growing the Afghan security forces. These gains were tangible to the point that the Taliban were actually signaling a willingness to talk peace. Yet in a matter of 6 weeks, and actually in our 11th year of fighting no less, we watched in disbelief as 5 U.S. service members desecrated Qurans at Bagram Airfield, leading to a spate of deadly rioting, dozens of Afghan citizens killed, and the murder of 2 Army advisors inside the Ministry of Interior, rattling a tenuous partnership with the Afghans to the core and casting serious doubt on whether that trust could be regained. And then the unthinkable, that a U.S. Army Staff Sergeant could wander off and commit such a horrific act would stir a visceral reaction even in the most ideal political circumstances, especially to those of us who have worn the uniform. Actually, in my wildest dreams, I couldn't imagine these events unfolding when I first started planning this event back in January. But still, despite these tragic setbacks, both President Obama and President Karzai remain committed to the goal of building a capable Afghan security force to see that they take the lead in combat operations over the next year and then assume a full responsibility for security across Afghanistan by the end of 2014. Today, I have the distinct pleasure of introducing 3 experts who have a wealth of ground-level, one-on-one experience working with the Afghan security forces. Following their introductions, I've asked each of them to provide an overview of their recent experiences and reflections on the future of the advisory mission. And after their remarks, I'll start off with a few questions to get the conversation started, and we can open it up. To my immediate left, Major Fernando Lujan is both a visiting fellow at the Center for New American Security and an Army Special Forces officer currently serving in the Afghan-Pakistan HANDS program. He recently returned to the United States after leading a new pilot program called the Afghan Coin Advisory and Assistance Team, or CAT-A, a combined team of specially selected Afghan officers, civilians, and language-capable U.S. military officers who assist commanders at all levels in conducting full-spectrum counterinsurgency operations. The team embeds with Afghan units on the ground and reports directly to the ISAF commander, now General Allen, with insights about the Afghan perspective of COIN and emerging operational realities. As a member of the Afghan-Pakistan HANDS program, Major Lujan has been trained in Dari and will spend the next 3 to 5 years rotating between his position in theater and an Afghan policy-related job in Washington. Prior to joining CNAS, Major Lujan served as an assistant professor of politics, policy, and strategy at the United States Military Academy and an associate of the West Point Combating Terrorism Center. From 2003 to 2006, he conducted counterinsurgency and counterterrorism missions in Iraq, Afghanistan, Colombia, and the tri-border area as a commander of a Special Forces Operational Detachment Alpha. Beyond his military work, Major Lujan has served as a part-time fellow to the House Foreign Affairs Committee and a term member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He holds a Bachelor of Science from the United States Military Academy at West Point and MPP from Harvard University. To his left, Captain T.C. Cutroneo has over 14 years' experience in the U.S. Army Reserve and Massachusetts Army National Guard in a variety of infantry and intelligence assignments as an enlisted soldier, a non-commissioned officer, and a commissioned officer. He is currently the commander of Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 304th Infantry Regiment, though in his day job, he actually served as a police officer in the Boston Police Department's Youth Violence Strike Force, or gang unit. Captain Cutroneo holds a bachelor's degree in criminal justice from Bridgewater State College in Massachusetts. He is also a highly decorated veteran of both Iraq and Afghanistan, having been handpicked twice by General Petraeus to serve in critical assignments, first as an embedded Special Operations Police Advisor in Iraq, and later as an embedded advisor to the G2, or Chief of Intelligence, of the Afghan Civil Order Police. And finally, to his left, Captain Russell Galeti is a U.S. Army infantry officer currently serving as a logistician on the staff of the 1st Battalion, 145th Armored Regiment of the Ohio Army National Guard. Captain Galeti has served in the Ohio Guard in numerous positions as a light and mechanized infantryman and tank crew member since first enlisting as a private in 1998 and achieving the rank of Staff Sergeant before receiving his commission as an officer. He is a decorated veteran of both Iraq and Afghanistan, to include receiving a Valorous Award for his actions in combat. While in Afghanistan, Captain Galeti served as a member of a combined Hungarian-United States Operational Mentor and Liaison Team, also called an OMLET, to train the Afghan National Army. Captain Galeti is a 2005 graduate of Kent State University with bachelor's degrees in history and political science, and he is currently a Master of Science in Foreign Service candidate at Georgetown University's Walsh School of Foreign Service, concentrating his studies on international development. His academic and professional interests center on cooperation between development and security organizations in low-intensity conflict and using development to mitigate instability and armed conflict in the developing world. And with that, I'll ask each of these members to share their experiences, and we'll start the conversation. I'll turn it over to Major Lujan.
First, okay, great. Well, thank you for coming out here. Very kind introduction, Nick. I appreciate it, but I assure you I'm not an expert in any of this stuff. I've been doing it for a little while, but this is the sort of stuff that it takes a long, long time to build any true expertise in. I think if there's any use I can offer you is just that I had a pretty interesting job for the last 14 months in Afghanistan. Last year I was over, and it was a job that was a bit of an experiment within an experiment within an experiment, right? None of the things that I was in, the programs I was in, existed even 2 or 3 years ago, and they were really all a response to big problems that we were facing in Afghanistan, right? One of them was called the AFPAC program. Okay, so this thing was created in response to the critique that we aren't fighting a 10-year war in Afghanistan, we're fighting a 1-year war 10 times, right? And so, we have this constant turnover and people never come back to the same jobs and they don't really understand the culture and the language. So how about we take about 200 officers, train them in Dari or Pashto, I was trained in Dari, and then send them over back and forth and back and forth and back and forth into the same jobs in Afghanistan over the course of 3 to 5 years. And so I volunteered for that, and I've just returned from the first assignment there. So, happy to talk about that later. It briefed really well. It's an awesome theory. It didn't work out so well in the implementation phase, all right? And we could talk about why some of that happened and what kind of impact that has on the whole idea of embedded advising and work in Afghanistan and whatnot. But that's my background. That's where I came from. And then I said within an experiment, right, there's this other thing called the Counterinsurgency Advisory Assistance Team, which again didn't exist before. Was created by General McChrystal in response to another big problem. And that one was that he's up in Kabul. He's a 4-star general, right? And when he goes out to visit bases for 2 or 3 hours, he flies in the helicopter. He receives a PowerPoint briefing. He talks, but that's one perspective, right? And that's not going to give him really a good sense of what reality is on the ground. And so, and given all the different bureaucratic layers that exist between the guy that's out on a platoon cop in the middle of Helmand somewhere and him back in Kabul in this very secure area, by the time stuff gets all the way up, it tends to be filtered out, right? And, a lot of the bad news, a lot of things. So he had this idea where, hey, why don't I create this organization of about 50 guys, right? About 60% contract and the rest active duty green suiters, but almost all from the Special Forces, Special Operations community. So guys that spent a long time in the SEALs or in the Green Berets, have done a lot of time and have fought against insurgencies, or in some cases helped insurgencies, over the course of many, many years. Have some experience, and let's get them out and let's just have them full-time in bed with units in the field, right? And so they'll go out there, they'll spend, become part of the furniture, get a sense of what's happening out in the field, and then report that directly back to me. Skip all the layers of bureaucracy, and at the same time, act as sort of coaches to these guys. Right? Because in a lot of cases, it is like 21, 22-year-old kids, people your age really, that are out there that have tremendous responsibility. They're trying to figure out how to do counterinsurgency, and you're trying to assist them. And so you could go up to them and say, hey, might want to think about trying this. I saw this other unit down the road that did this, it worked, or this didn't work, or think about doing this, and help them learn how to apply that theory of counterinsurgency to their specific environments. And then, finally, the final experiment was to take the language ability and to try to do this on the Afghan side, right? So put on an Afghan army uniform, grow the beard out, and on a lot of cases, go and embed with Afghan units that didn't have coalition forces with them for extended periods of time, talk to them in their own languages, and figure out what's your perspective. What do you think of these Americans that live down the road from you? What do you really think about our conflict and our involvement? And do you trust these guys? And what problems do you have? And that sort of stuff. And so, so that is my background in the stuff that I've been doing. I'm only going to talk for about 5 minutes here or so. So I highlight a couple things here before we move on. But I want to do like a really aggressive Q&A session with you guys. Like, do not be afraid of asking really aggressive questions. I'm not going to answer stuff that I have no direct firsthand experience in, but what I can offer is a lot of the Afghan perspective, some of the trust issues that are on the ground, the things that we saw there, the things that are inhibiting some of our advisors from being able to do their jobs. So just a couple things to think about. First off, understand that there are different competing models at work in Afghanistan when it comes to advising and embedding and this stuff, right? And one of the main models that we've been using for the last two years is this thing called partnered operations, right? Where basically you have a large American or coalition battalion type formation partnered with another large Afghan formation that's there, right? And this is the luxury of having the surge in forces that we've had in Afghanistan over the last 2 years, where we have a lot of boots on the ground, so we can take these big units in there, pair them up with Afghan units, and they will ostensibly do operations together, shona by shona, right? Side, shoulder to shoulder, side by side, they're going to do this stuff. But one thing to think about is, in that environment, while the surge has allowed us to achieve a lot of positive things, right? Because we got more resources on the ground, more boots on the ground. You can push into areas that you have not been able to go to before, take a lot of the initiative away from the Taliban, move into these very difficult places. And it briefs well, right? I mean, when it comes to metrics and how you decide if you're being successful or not, you're going to be able to produce a lot of immediate metrics. The area I'm moving into, the white space, the enemy killed in action or captured, all these sorts of things are going to be reported up. But there's a negative side to the surge, right? And something that I hope we can talk about later, and that is it breeds also a certain sense of arrogance, right? A certain sense, because if you're on the ground, right, and you're a commander in charge of this 600 U.S. soldier unit, right, and you've got these guys in the ratty uniforms, right, sitting on your base as well, the Afghans, and you have a choice, and you've got pressure from high, right? We've got a surge that's only going to last a couple of years, and we've got to show immediate results, and you have a choice between either taking the lead yourself and having your guys, the Americans, do the mission and go get aggressive and achieve all these results, or going to the Afghans first and having the Afghans truly take the lead and waiting for them and having the patience to do that, even though they're not as capable, and that your mission may not even succeed, and if it does, it's going to take 3 times as long, right? A lot of times, the negative side is that you tend to focus on leading the operations yourself, and that, while it produces lots of transient, positive benefits, also does not do anything sustainable, right? It does not, you're not doing anything to improve the capability of the Afghans that you're living with in that area. And so, you may see some benefits, but are they really going to last after you have to pull out of the country or reduce your size? So there's that model, and then we can talk later about contrasting that with the other model, which is sort of embedded partnering, right? We have much smaller teams that are embedded, and really by the size, it's a limiting factor, right? When you have 600 guys on your base, 600 Americans, right, or 100, and 20 Afghans, it's very easy to get, very myopic in your outlook and to kind of have this arrogance and do things yourself and drag your Afghans around as an afterthought. But if you're there with 15 or 20 guys, it changes the whole dynamic because you can't do it yourself all the time anymore, right? It makes you start to think about, I've got to work with the Afghans here to do that. There are all sorts of associated problems with that. We're not filling those kinds of embedded small teams with the right kinds of people. A lot of time, there's a certain stigma that comes with being an embedded advisor when it comes to the conventional forces that are out there. It's not as cool as being in a combat unit and operating, the more traditional roles that are out there. And so when you end up manning people on these small teams, a lot of times you end up with sort of the JV or the freshman quality guys, right? I mean, the second, third, fourth string type talent on these units, when in fact, you need the very best that understand how to work through culture and language and understand, how to have the patience to do these things and to affect the Afghan units. And so that is a huge issue that I'd love to talk to you later. And then last thing I was going to say is just understanding some of the trust issues that are there, right? It's not purely a matter of Taliban infiltrators that are sleeper agents that are working their way into Afghan security forces, and that is the threat. That is, by and large, the way that we conceptualize it for a lot of guys that are in the field. We just think that these guys are Taliban, they're in uniform, and that's the threat. That's part of the threat, right? But there is also things that we do by our own actions, some of that arrogance that I talked about before, or just some of the cultural insensitivity that exists, that we act as actually our own worst enemy, right? And one of those things that works against us is the Taliban narrative, right? And the way that they recruit, which basically says that Westerners are here to occupy our country and to destroy Islam, right? And so every time, like he talked about, right, we do something that plays into that narrative or can be exploited into that, burning Qurans, killing civilians, whether accidental or intentional, and that horrible incident that occurred a few weeks ago. Anything that can be exploited for that, there is a mechanism out there, right? The Taliban is phenomenal at taking incidents and turning them into this narrative and getting that message out and using it to recruit people, to flip people, and in some cases, not just to work on villagers, but to work on the partnered forces that we have, the Afghan soldiers that are there, that may not have been radical to begin with, maybe were ambivalent about their feelings about the Americans, but when they see things like this happen, can become self-radicalized. And then the last piece of that trust is the resentment that breeds, right? When you've got a Western force that is trying to impose Western models on Afghans, right? And saying, hey, we're going on patrol. Give me 6 Afghans. Let's go out. I'm not going to tell you what the mission is. This is where we're going to be. And trying to play sort of the drill sergeant mentality and expect that we could take our methods, translate them into Dari or Pashto, hand them over to the Afghans and expect them to use them the same way, right? That creates a certain amount of resentment that's there. And it's rare that you're going to be so insensitive that you're going to cause someone to actually raise up and have a green on blue incident, actually shoot their coalition advisor, but more often than not, by acting like that and being arrogant and not having that kind of common respect and partnership, they're just going to think you're a jerk, right? And they're not going to listen to what you say, and you're not going to be able to influence them. And that is the soul of the advisory mission, right? That's what we really succeed or fail on, is not what we can generate when it comes to metrics, but how much we can influence these Afghan security forces. And if you have that kind of lack of understanding and friction that exists there, you really end up sabotaging your mission in the long run. So anyway, I know that's a lot to think about or whatnot. I just wanted to throw some of the main concepts there. I look forward to talking in the Q&A when we get back to it. Thanks.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming. I've had the pleasure of working in the same areas as Fernando. We've run across the same paths a couple times. We were on very similar missions. He was assigned with a CAT, and I sometimes explain it as a one-man CAT. I was brought there by General Petraeus. I'd been working specifically for General Petraeus since 2004. I was working with the then Iraqi police, special police commandos. And then over the last couple of years, I'd taken direction from him and sought some schooling, and then was brought back into Afghanistan to do a very similar mission. My background was initially a conventional kind of infantry type army assignments, and then per his direction became an intel officer with the U.S. Army, and then went to human terrain systems. Which human terrain systems? Anybody here have heard human terrain systems? Kind of popular in among grad students who were just discussing earlier. But what it is it essentially is fielding social scientists and anthropologists, civilians, into the battle space, working with the U.S. Army, and providing a cultural picture for the battle space commander. So they can make a little bit slightly more informed decision on their operations, either whether they be lethal or non-lethal. And human terrain systems, it really targets perceptions. So when something is done, they can poll the civilian population or the Afghan population or the U.S., whatever the target population may be, and actually quantify their level or perception of the operation, whether it was good and bad, and actually be able to put a number to that. So that's where human terrain systems kind of, that's where they make their money. Prior to deploying to Afghanistan, I worked with the human terrain systems, but then didn't actually work with them once deployed. I then took my specific directions from General Petraeus and essentially traveled the country, living with and operating with an Afghan force known as ANCOP, the Afghan National Civil Order Police, which is slightly different than the uniform police, not the guys in blue that you see on on a lot of the pictures that represent the rule of law, the actual police force in Afghanistan, but they're not the army. They're kind of in between. Like similar to the gendarmerie of France, nationally deployable, a little bit more muscular. And my focus was embedding myself in a very smallest is best type of fundamental in practice, and becoming I've used the term a couple times. We've seen the movie Inception, where you want to essentially instill a thought into the person or the party you're with, your partner, without them thinking you're the one who thought of it. It's their thought. And therefore, an Afghan solution is an enduring solution. If we come in as that conventional large army force and we say, you're going to do this because we think it's the best thing, it's the best practice, well, we are considered a good idea fairy. And they will entertain us for the moment, but then the minute you leave, they go back to their own ways. Why? Because it wasn't their solution. That will not endure. So what you want to do is you want to work within the force, become a partner like Fernando had mentioned. You really, everything starts with trust, building that relationship. And then you're going to come up to mutual decisions, and they're going to come up to their own decisions. And that, in essence, will endure, and they'll be able to provide their own operations and direction. So I focused on counterinsurgency, as most of us have. And as well as being in there and providing this type of guidance, I provided them actually formal military intelligence training, counterinsurgency training, and then conducted operations with them in the lead, with them to see if engaging the whole time whether they're viable for autonomous counterinsurgency operations, what they need help in, what should we refine our practices in order to help them to take the lead, essentially. It's not really about our operations, it's how our operations affect them, and can they take the lead on their own. So I did that from north to south, east to west throughout Afghanistan for 1 year. I've worked with everybody from the State Department to the NGOs to fellow coalition to mostly just targeted within the Afghan force. So I had that unique perspective of looking at Afghanistan problem from an Afghan's eyes. So not really working with big army, working with just the Afghan force. I can tell you about operations and the ground truth. A lot of us, we get our information from mass media, from newspapers, from from our televisions. And as has been alluded to earlier, there's always the ground truth. What really happened there? What were the actual events that took place? And sometimes there's a great disparity. So commanders, especially General Petraeus, like every other effective commander, they want to get that ground truth. So they want to, immediately after a report, they're going to call you back and say, what really happened there? And that's where we provided some intimate insight into what the events had happened. And, providing that actual truth of what the operations and the ramifications of good, bad, or otherwise have actually taken place. I look forward to answering any questions afterwards. I don't have as much experience as Fernando in special operations and special forces operations. You have to understand I was a traditional guy put into a non-traditional role and then forced to act accordingly. I've been doing it for a little while, so I have some experience in it, but I've never actually been formally trained in special forces, even though it was a special forces mission. And I've had the experience with mostly just the police department, police forces, and not the Army. And there is a large difference there. So I'll be looking forward to answering any questions at the end.
Afternoon, everybody. As Nick introduced me, I'm Russell Galeti. I'm a captain in the Ohio Army National Guard. Sort of like a TC, but not as in-depth. My experience was traditional, conventional infantry, non-commissioned officer, sergeant, and then later an officer. Back in 2009, I was actually counting on deploying to the Sinai Peninsula as just a platoon leader to do a 10-month tour as part of multinational force and observers, and I found out that I was instead slated to go on an omelet. My email back to my commander at that time was, what the heck's an omelet? And unique to the National Guard, every state has a partner country, and Ohio is partnered with both Hungary and Serbia. And so NATO fields what are known as operational men and liaison teams, informally known as omelets. And we've heard probably just about every joke that there is about omelets. But Hungary either did not have the manpower, the experience, the equipment, or the funding available. I'm not sure why, but they went to Ohio and said, we would love to do one with our Ohio partners if we can go half and half on this. And so I was on our third iteration, going at 6-month intervals. And the omelet essentially was a 28 American, 28 Hungarian advising team that was supposed to advise at the battalion level, which is on any given day anywhere from 200 to 600 Afghans. And it was for a 6-month deployment where we would essentially embed as low as possible in that Afghan unit and advise them on all facets of combat training and administration. So as I was telling Fernando and TC earlier, we did everything from help them with their day-to-day administrative duties when they were back on the base, or if they were the down company out of the 3 companies in the battalion, and they weren't going on operations that week. We'd help them sort out their weapons room and general administration of property, and then we would go on missions right alongside them and take them dismounted into villages and just kind of subtly nudge our Afghan counterparts in one direction or another and help them come to, as TC mentioned, an Afghan solution to whatever problems they are facing in combat training or administration. For my deployment being a very ad hoc deployment where some faceless bureaucrat up at state headquarters just kind of put together 28 Americans, it was pretty unique, somewhat frustrating. In some ways, we were very successful. Our colonel, starting at the top, our colonel was a special forces officer who happened to be in the Ohio National Guard as a special forces officer, and he really set the tone for our deployment, kept our unit together, gave us just the right guidance, and did just enough for our team to kind of make us special or make us different from a lot of omelets where they didn't achieve success or achieve poor results. And some soldiers just didn't fit the mold, like Fernando was talking about. They were 3rd, 4th string guys who, unique to the reserve component, perhaps needed a job that year, or couldn't find employment, or just needed to keep deploying for whatever personal reasons. And otherwise, poor advisory material got thrown on this mission also because they were the ones volunteering the loudest. So there was a huge ad hoc factor to my omelet that kind of set the tone for our deployment before we even met each other. And there's a very much a do-it-yourself factor also, where the state of Ohio, which has engineer brigades, mechanized infantry battalions, combined arms battalions, medical units, just didn't know how to field an omelet, didn't know how to train them, didn't know how to equip us. And so as one of the officers in the group, it was really on me and my counterpart, who was another company advisor, also a lieutenant and captain. We would just call up Ohio State and say, we're going to be spending 6 months with Hungarian teammates, and then we're going to take these Hungarians and we're going to go to Afghanistan. We're going to spend another 6 months with Afghans. So we had to call up the Ohio State, Eastern European Language Department, and we were lucky enough to get a professor on loan for a weekend, and she just took us through cultural awareness and sensitivity for Hungary. And then next month we got a guy from the MENA studies area, and we got a Afghan lesson where we did an entire weekend's worth of Afghan cultural awareness and sensitivity, and in that respect, it was very much a do-it-yourself component to our preparation for our deployment. Before our deployment, we were privileged, and I emphasize that term. We were very privileged. Somebody, as I was telling Fernando earlier, somebody in our training shop up at state headquarters just said, hey, there's this training out there for you. It's 2 months long. They sent all 28 of us to it, and it was called the Combined Combat Advisor Development Course at Fort Riley, Kansas. It's now at Fort Polk, Louisiana, and it was 2 months of, I would call it senior undergraduate or master's level counterinsurgency training. And in my eyes, in 13 years in uniform, in enlisted and officer capacities, the single best thing the Army has ever done right by me, where it was 2 months of classroom discussion, a lot of flat classroom hierarchy discussion where a private was allowed to speak just as freely as a colonel and could, just say what he thought about counterinsurgency, say what he thought about combat advising. A lot of tactical Dari Persian language training for us, and a lot of experienced practitioners coming back to teach as civilian contractors who gave us some excellent insight into true partnering, how to build rapport from the outset with your Afghans, a lot of role playing where they actually had former Afghan interpreters and Afghan military personnel come in, do what were called key leader engagements, where we got to sit down and speak with a guy who was role-playing as an Afghan colonel through an interpreter, so we got to learn how to use interpreters, and do all those things that a lot of what we were calling earlier today general-purpose forces miss when they either choose to do coin or when they completely ignore coin at all. And so that training just really set the tone for what I feel was an excellent deployment for our team. Got to Hungary, and that was really a dry run where we got to experience, it wasn't Afghan culture, but it was Hungarian culture, and we got to spend 6 months trying to build rapport with peers, counterparts, and trying to train them, trying to get them to come to solutions on their own, because the Hungarian army is still very post-Soviet and just in many ways different from the American army in the way they use and employ personnel and the tactics that they kind of tend toward. And so that was almost a dry run for the American people, where we got 6 months of partnering, advising, kind of leading people to their own solutions without outright telling them what they had to do before doing it in combat with the Afghans. And it worked. Some parts didn't. Some pretty great frustrations. A lot of successes. But we got to Afghanistan, and you know, we had 6 months with our Afghan battalion, which I feel is too short a time. But you'll hear us griping today possibly about general purpose forces and about conventional forces and forces that kind of turn their backs on counterinsurgency theory, doctrine, and tactics. And I feel like we were the conventional guys who, despite a lot of setbacks, a lot of frustrations, and a lot of ill fits, or as TC was calling them, malaligned actors, you know, we got it right, or we got it as right as we could, considering the conditions that we entered into. So looking forward to speaking with the other panelists and answering questions for the rest of the afternoon. Thank you, Nick.
Well, thank you. I think I'll just open up with probably one of the most obvious questions is, you know, is the 2014 timetable, is it realistic? And given your experiences collectively, what do you think will be needed beyond 2014 in terms of a partnership strategy? Any one of you can take it, or if Russell, you want to keep going?
Is 2014?
Is 2014 realistic? And given your experience, what do you think will be needed in terms of partnership with the Afghan security forces beyond that date?
I mean, that's a very, very political, strategic level question for a tactical guy like me. But yeah, it's I don't think it is flatly. I don't.
Yeah, look, it's really easy to train infantrymen, right? I mean, it's relatively easy, right, to put guys through, to teach them how to walk patrols, to issue them rifles and uniforms and have them go out and do that. It's a lot harder to train what we call in the Army enablers, right? So guys that do logistics and medical and engineering and all sorts of things. But those are really kind of the glue that help you hold units together when they start becoming self-sustaining, right? So when we start to draw down the number of forces and have to step back and push Afghans into the lead, you know, those are the kinds of things that they're going to need. They're going to need to get logistical resupply to their guys, you know, and when they're remote little fire bases out in the middle of Zabul or Orizgan or one of these places in the south that's still bitterly contested, you know, comes under attack and they've got to request some sort of fire support or reinforcement or whatnot, they've got to be able to use the radios to do that and have them running. And so we're not there yet on that, right? We're not even close to there yet on that. And that takes, and you've got a lot of issues that you're dealing with in the interim, right? Because, you know, while a pretty good job, you know, you get paid a decent salary as an Afghan foot soldier, right? But put yourself in the shoes of one of these guys, right? That has been down in a very dangerous area, going on patrols, has probably been assigned to an area for 3 or 4 or 5 years, right? He's seen this churn of American units that all come in. You know, they're all in sprint mode, right? They're there for 6 months or 9 months or a year, going at a very frenetic pace. And this guy, you know, not living in the same kinds of conditions, right? Maybe he's got one, you know, on a battalion headquarters, I saw where they had one broken shower spigot, right? And that was really it. And they shared it and was at, like, you know, waist level. And, you know, the guys had been there, it freezes over during the winter. And I mean, these guys just really tough conditions for a long period of time and rarely get to see their families. And so, you know, they're being dragged in one direction. And so finally they get a chance to go to Kabul to get some training to be a mechanic or whatever it may be, right? Some specialized stuff that's there. And he graduates after 8 weeks or 12 weeks. And now he's got some practical skill in repairing automobiles or whatnot, right? And he's got a choice of, well, I haven't seen my family all this time. Now I've got this skill. You know, I can go work on the civilian economy and make 4 or 5 times more than I would as a soldier. And the kicker being that we're really not going to pay him any more money on the military side to be a mechanic. He's going to draw still the same pay when he goes back down to, you know, to his area. So I can either go back down, earn the same amount of money, keep getting shot at for another 3 or 4 years working as a mechanic, or go off. So you're dealing with issues like that as well that are not as obvious, right? Other than just the pure part of literacy and trying to get guys into these programs and build them to have skills like that. And so it becomes a very difficult problem. And so, when you talk about whether it's realistic or not, 2014, I'll give you the short answer. It's probably not realistic to really have a self-sustaining when it comes to enablers like that. And what you're going to end up needing is some sort of a light fingerprint to be able to at least assist these units as they start to try to transition and do operations on their own. And we did. I don't want to take too long to talk, but just tell you 1 minute about a unit because I think it'd be useful for you on this question. We had the chance to go out and visit the very first 2 independent Afghan battalions, Kandaks they're called, in Afghanistan to sort of see what the situation was. And this is in an area called Zabul, right, which is very, very contested area still, right? And it is actually the area right after 9/11 where the Taliban was kicked out and came back, one of the first places they came to reconstitute. So unlike other safer places in the north or the west, like Bamyan or Herat, where we've done some of this transition stuff, this is an area the Taliban still very much wants to control and they're going to fight. And so we thought it would be a really invaluable bellwether to go spend time with these units that no longer really had formal coalition support anymore, right? But we're asked to do operations on their own and secure their own areas and see what kinds of problems are they having. And, we went in kind of honestly a little worried about that maybe these guys were just going to have a bunker mentality and sit in their bases and not do their jobs. That actually wasn't the problem. The problem with these guys were eager. That actually was really humbled by these guys that, they're riding around in these, we're going with them in these Ford Ranger thin-skinned pickup trucks with no armor on them, and you're watching them after prayer every morning, putting these big Afghan flags on and going up and down these roads with all these IEDs and ambushes. And, they're trying to do their jobs. They're getting out there and doing this. They're very brave and they're being aggressive about doing their operations. But their problems are vehicles are breaking down, right? Because they can't get the spare parts and no one can fix them when they arrive. And so, if you've got 30 vehicles in a unit and only 10 are working, that's going to obviously limit the ability to do operations in your area, right? Communications gear wasn't letting them talk. They weren't able to get resupply. They were running out of stuff. And so you could just see in that area, the Taliban was trying to kind of do the islands in the stream dynamic, right, where they're all on these 20 little bases and they're trying to isolate them from each other and then get closer and closer and get them to have less and less freedom of movement. And all the lack of logistical supplies and support and enablers was just compounding that problem. I think, if I had to predict 2014, that is a similar dynamic that we're going to be fighting across the country as we have to do this with more and more units and have to say, hey, okay, you're on your own, best of luck, let us know if you need something. That's what they're going to have to struggle with. So.
I think counterinsurgency is commonly referred to as warfare at the graduate level. There are so many variables involved, and even if it's protracted and orchestrated exactly as it should be, let's say a textbook counterinsurgency operation, it's still going to test our will to stay the fight. And what that means, it's not going to happen in our timetable, and it's not going to happen as expected. It's not going to happen in 1 or 5 years. Historically, counterinsurgencies are over 10 years to quell, or insurgencies, I should say. So a well-orchestrated counterinsurgency campaign to say that you will definitively be out by 2014 and all will be well is to say that, this extremely complex and very variables every day learning process, learning to fly the plane, learning to build a plane as we're flying it, essentially, will happen by 2014 is a bit of an enthusiastic statement. Can it be done? There are recipes for success. We've all seen them. They're out there. But it has to be continued in that exact, protracted, well-orchestrated manner, or else it may be a bit enthusiastic saying 2014 is the day. We will have to accept some maybe risks or maybe acceptance of certain achievements by then. Whether it's considered successful or not, that's hard to say. But we must remember that this isn't conventional warfare. You can't really, it's hard to put certain dates. But at the same time, our will to stay the fight is one of the weapons used against us, because we have that man on the moon syndrome. We like things done today, tomorrow, right away. And when they're not, we start questioning ourselves. Well, the enemy knows this. They know that if they wait us out, we may just pull all support politically. and through the will of the people here who supports our politicians, who support the funding. So you have to remember this is part of their, it's also a tactic used against us.
This is definitely an effort that takes decades. And I think true partnering, much more significant presence as far as advising goes and less of a conventional presence should be a factor in this years ago. However, now I think it's even more important. And you know, the saying goes, amateurs talk tactics and professionals talk logistics. When I was told I was going to go from being an infantry officer to a battalion logistics officer, I thought I was being punished. But it's actually a promotion in several ways. But as Fernando said, the logistics aspect of it was what consistently held us up the most at the battalion level, getting ammunition to our combat outposts, just getting food, getting guys to use their radios. We finally got really nice FM radios for the Afghans, but they've been operating under these conditions for at least a decade, if not more, where they were just using cell phones. And that was what was convenient. That was what was most field expedient. That's what was able to sometimes get them mortars on target or get ammunition to where they needed it to, was the Roshan cell phone network. And so when they're forced to operate in such a capacity for so long, to think that, okay, the surge is here, the advisors are here, the ammunition's here, the radios are here, we got you guys combat advisors who can get you close air support, medevac, whatever you need. It's 2009 now. We haven't been paying much attention to you since 2003. To think that all that can be done from 2009 to 2014 without all that background work and getting that logistical muscle memory in, getting that advisor experience in, so that the battalion logistics officer in the Afghan battalion can say, I remember what this was like when I was a platoon leader 5 years ago. This is what my frustration was with the system at this time. This stuff takes time, and you got to build that institutional memory. And from 2009 to 2014, I think is just too short a time for anything that we're doing right now. So like TC said, I think there are recipes. I don't know that we'll pursue them. And it does require, I think, a much more committed advisory presence and support presence.
I think we'll open it up and have a conversation. Are there any questions?
For giving us insight into your personal experiences. All three of you look quite young when I see you in the background of the war against USSR, because at that time three of you would be very young. So my question is that US has a fair amount of experience of approximately 10 years working with Afghanistan while a proxy war was fought through them against USSR, which ultimately ended into the disintegration of USSR. So how much that working knowledge or the knowledge base was used to launch an operation on the same soil, dealing with the same people? And how much research about unique nature of Afghan people was done prior to having boots on the ground? Because Afghan are very unique in the sense that saying in Pashto says that Tupak Zama Kanun De, that is, weapon is my law. So in order to deal with a very unique kind of people, how much research was previously done?
Yeah, I'll answer that. Almost none. At the beginning, I will say that we obviously know, this is all in literature and books and everything, that the beginning intervention in Afghanistan after 9/11 was largely led by the intelligence community and special forces. I have gone and spoken. Obviously, in this format, I can only talk about a certain amount of things, but there was a certain amount of preparation done for that. Whatever was available from existing sources at that point was there, but it wasn't nearly as much as was needed because there was that disengagement in the years that after we stopped supporting the Mujahideen through Pakistan, and so basically almost all of that knowledge was lost. And for the military going into those areas, even amongst the special operations forces and the guys who are there, they normally do get language and cultural orientation. It wasn't nearly as much as it should be, and it is a little embarrassing that it was 2009 before we came up with a program like the Afghan program, where we said, okay, wow, we're really blind about some of the culture and language here, so let's at least make the effort to spend several months teaching these guys some basic Dari and Pashto and teaching them about the history and the culture, have them actually talk to Afghans before they do it, and then send them back and forth to the country so they don't just go one time and then lose that institutional knowledge. But that is the exception, and that's 200 or 300 people selected to do that sort of thing, right? And that's not typically the mentality. And it is embarrassing now to say, and I just had a conversation with some folks in the Pentagon about this, where we were really discussing who's going to be filling these advisor teams over the next 3 to 4 years, right? Because the big problem, what we're really talking about here is getting better at doing it with a smaller footprint, right? Because everyone knows, I mean, when you send thousands and thousands of troops and you have the big footprint, it also generates a lot of pressure to get that, large investment out, right? I mean, now there's 18-year-old young kids deploying overseas. They have families back here. They're not part of these sort of specialized little communities. They're used to being gone, and so you start getting this really big demand to pull guys back out and, hey, show the timeline on when you're going to be there. But these conflicts don't yield very well to large influxes of resources. In fact, in many cases, putting more resources on the ground makes it even worse after a certain point, right? I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've seen over the course of the surge, all this money being invested in, and they say, okay, and the model of money is a weapon system. I've heard that said so many times, right? That more is better, and the more you can do. So you see millions of dollars go into these little districts that have previously had no investment whatsoever, and after you get past a certain point, past the point that they could actually use it to promote governance, the stuff just goes into the wallets of these malign actors that exist on the ground. And so you're creating this conflict economy and doing all sorts of negative things that all the people here that know way more about development know than I do, but I know enough to see it happening on the ground. And so we've got to, rather than sort of the surge model, the very large footprint, instant results thing, we got to get better at the small footprint, longer timeline type stuff. And we are typically bad at that because in general purpose forces, we are honestly pretty blind to talent when it goes there, right? We'll say, I need a person for a year with this specialty at this rank, but we can't say, I need a really good person that gets the culture and knows this and has been on multiple tours. So that's pretty rare to be able to do that, especially, anything approaching the sizes of these advisor teams that are going to be involved in Afghanistan going past 2014. And so that is a really big issue. And I was saying, I was talking to folks in the Pentagon, well, if we're transitioning to an advisor model, drawing down our troops and now going back to sort of smaller footprint with these embedded small advisor teams out there, who's going to fill that? How are you going to find the guys to do it? And I had someone tell me, well, the bad news is if you have been to Afghanistan before and you have experience, you are less likely to rotate in, right? Because we're trying to share the experience and get people enough time at home and get, and guys have done all this deploying. So you're losing, actually, the model that we're using to deploy and select people for this is not necessarily the one that yields the most effectiveness on the ground or addresses the issues that you're talking about, where we need some degree of familiarity and institutional knowledge. And I mean, you're not even talking, that's just talking culture and language. We're not even talking about the real coin of the realm, which is relationships, right? Which is, the guys that are most effective over there, some of them not necessarily just the special operations community, but other guys that are civilians and have been over there multiple times, are the ones that have personal relationships they've cultivated over the course of 6 or 7 years, right? Guys that have been, they go in, I saw an SF team in Orzgan that guys were there for their sixth or seventh tour, and they knew personally, they'd seen all these leaders, both civilian and military on the Afghan side. They'd known them since 2003, 2004 going in there. And so what they could do as far as influencing and advising, and affecting from behind the scenes, really what you're supposed to do as an advisor, was tremendous compared to what you can do. You sort of there for 6 months, never been to Afghanistan before, no real sense of who's there, without all the good intentions in the world, but you're set up for failure from the start. So.
Other comments, please?
Coming at your question from a different angle, I think it was in a free book pile or trash can at Fort Riley, Kansas, where I found The Bear Went Over the Mountain, and I think it was The Other Side of the Mountain, which are 2 books. One was, I believe, Soviet perspectives or retrospectives on operations in Afghanistan, where a Soviet battalion commander, or company commander, or just Soviet soldiers were interviewed after the fact and said, we were in this province, in this this valley, and we entered this way with these vehicles, and this is what happened. We got blown up, or we got ambushed, or we destroyed the village, or all these different tales from the Soviet experience in Afghanistan. And then the complementary book to that was, I think it was The Other Side of the Mountain, but it's essentially a counterinsurgency take on it. Like, here's what happened, here's the interview. I think it had an Afghan perspective, but it also talked, yeah, and it talked about the counterinsurgency aspect of this is what the Soviets did wrong from a tactical point of view. They should have done this. They should have sent, reconnaissance out. So tactically, that was one of the strongest ways we used any kind of lessons learned from previous experiences on the same ground, and to the point where I was able to flip open the index and go, okay, Baghlan province, this is what happened here, and I put it on my map, like, watch out for this, watch out for this. They'll try and draw you in here and then blow up the road behind you, and, shredded a mechanized infantry battalion in, 1980, whatever. The Army, however, the War on Terror has really enhanced our Center for Army Lessons Learned, which is kind of a central repository of informal tactics, techniques, and procedures. And back to that DIY component that I was talking about when we first got the word that we'd be deploying, they made themselves very available and very accessible in the way that I was able to just call them up and say, send me 30 copies of these 20 books that were in, Army, the Army had them in stock, and they were compiled lessons learned from interviews, oral histories, after-action reports. So the Army needed to get better first, I think, at keeping its own institutional knowledge intact. Maybe the next time around we'll be able to look at other conflicts in the same area and kind of learn from them, draw from them, and get more than just one book that's The Bear Went Out Over the Mountain. So from my perspective, also going from a deployment to Iraq as a machine gunner in 2004 to this ad hoc combat advisory mission in 2009, the improvement was there, definitely. I was telling Fernando earlier, they shuttled all 500 of us into a theater, locked the doors, put a special forces officer on the stage, and he said, what are your questions? Here's hand and arm signals that you don't use with the Iraqis. Here's things you don't say to them. Don't throw stones at the little kids, things like that. Very informal and very, I think, ineffective. And that was it. That was the extent. For 10 months in Iraq, that was all I got. However, in 2009, I got all this wonderful training. And as far as I'm concerned, that's the bare minimum. Once I got that training, I thought, why haven't we been doing this since 2001? Why hasn't every soldier in the Army got the level of training that I've got? Because that's, I think, the bare minimum cultural awareness, cultural sensitivity, and just kind of how to truly partner with host nation security forces that I think every soldier should have. And so in one way, we've come a very long way. In another way, some of the right assets are out there, but it's just maybe tying it all together that we're still not getting it quite right.
Can you take...
I'm sorry.
Could you take more than one question?
Sure, let's start with Farhad.
Yeah. I have here just a comment and also a question. Comments about the recent comment about the lawlessness of Afghans. I think that's a very unfair comment to say this. The Afghans say that their guns are it's their loss. No, we use guns against aggressors, and fortunately, Afghans do not see the coalition forces as aggressors and invaders. Even in the absence of laws, we come up with our own code of conduct, Pashtun code of conduct, Afghan code of conduct, and you guys were there. You've seen that the tribal chiefs and there are code of conduct that we have always for centuries we have followed that. So Afghans are not in favor of lawlessness.
Mm-hmm.
And just a question. 10 years since the start of the war in Afghanistan and the Taliban. I, as someone who lived and covered Afghanistan for 10 years, and you were out there, partnering with the Afghan forces, I just still do not understand who are the Taliban. How many are there? I mean, when we say that after 2014 the Afghans are not ready to fight the Taliban, who are they? What kind of weapons they have? I mean, they have AK-47, PK, and LPG. And why the Afghan forces cannot, fight them? I mean, why do we need these, more sophisticated, weapons that's existed in the world to fight such a force? I mean, they might be around 50,000, even 100,000, and now we're talking about 300,000 Afghan forces. Why they cannot fight them? Right. Yes, there's maybe a question of continuation. Maybe if you can, continue with the same level of support, yes. But otherwise, I don't see. I mean, why the Taliban should be that strong that the all international forces plus the Afghan forces cannot fight them.
Let's take one or two and then react.
So So along the same line, I mean, why do you think this war is not winnable? Is it because Pakistan does not stop supporting Tlaloc, or Pakistan itself support the Taliban, or not? Because I don't see them as strong. AK-47 versus M16 do not match. Robbie?
So I had two questions. One is for what Major Fernando was talking about not having bigger footprints and moving on to the smaller footprints. And now with the drawdown, do you see us relying on special SOF more so now? If so, the VSOs that are already operating at the village level in Afghanistan, do you see them being successful in the future and having those kind of smaller footprints and moving on to district and then provincial level eventually? Second question, what the captain was talking about institutional memory within the U.S. Army or the U.S. military. So this is not the first time that we operated counterinsurgency, Iraq and Afghanistan. We did that before, but we tend to forget it. Do you think that after this, after fighting this war for 10 years, the military is now going to have an institutional memory so that if we're going to be involved in this kind of warfare later on, we will know what to do? Or our strategy is now to move away from it and pretend that this never happened?
All great questions.
Sure.
So we go back to what is the insurgency? Who are the Taliban, real quick? And how many are there? Well, if you've studied, we just have to look back historically. What is an insurgency? An insurgency is a movement. It's a political movement, but it's a mentality and a perception. So if you're not Taliban today, you may be tomorrow. Or you have been since day one. You have a fundamental that you want to portray to, through subversion, through other tactics, to get rid of the government that is in there and put your own that is in your likeness and what you prefer. So that's one kind of like a pitfall for non-counterinsurgency operations or conventional operations, is we like to just say, here's the number of Taliban. If we just go in there and target these guys, we will kill all the bad guys, and we will walk out and say, hooray, we've done it. If that was true, the killing of Zarqawi in Iraq, or the killing, or the death of Osama bin Laden would have solved most of our problems. Why didn't it? Because it's not about a person, it's not about a number, it's about a mentality and a perception and an institution, and how, that's why there's so much focus on counterinsurgency operations, to target perceptions, to target institutional change. Because the Taliban are, yes, a group. There is a person that you can associate with that. But moreover, it's a mentality. It's the thought of, we have to make it undesirable for people to take up arms against a constituted democratic type of government that has been placed in and trying to be legitimized, to make that unappealing and to say that is the wrong thing to do. Very similar to how we target gang problems here in the United States. You have to make it unappealing for that child or that kid to grow up in the wrong way and say, I'm going to take up a gun and start a life of crime. It is the same way you have to attack the Taliban. So you have to somewhat remove yourself and say there is no specific number to this, there's no specific face to this. It's a movement. It's a mentality. And that's why we have to, sometimes when we say in counterinsurgency, our most effective weapons have nothing to do with shooting. And that is so true. Your money makers might be social developments, economical developments, foreign internal support and sustainment and support operations. That's what kills them in Taliban, and that's what kills the mentality, not actually going out and conducting lethal targeting. Is there a time and place for lethal targeting? Absolutely. At times and place, you must relentlessly chase the enemy and kill him. But that, in a counterinsurgency environment, has to be viewed as defensive in nature. In counterinsurgency, tactical operations, though may be offensive and paramount to the ground level, are actually defensive in a strategic counterinsurgency operations. Your more offensive weapons may be non-lethal.
Yeah, just to add a little bit on the Taliban piece. If you're actually interested in this stuff, there's a guy named Giustozzi, this Italian guy that wrote this book called Kalashnikov and Laptop. And he's also done some other stuff, Empire's Mother. There's all sorts of books he's written, but that's some of the best stuff if you really want to understand kind of who they are and the different factions and how they rose. I mean, obviously, this is like, we could talk literally for like 2 hours about this question, but just to do it in 30 seconds, look, it is, they would have you believe they're a monolithic group, but they're not. Quite sure Taliban is really sort of overall, Mullah Omar obviously head of that, and everyone pays lip service at least to say, hey, you know, he's leader of the faithful and we support him and do that. But there are some fissures there, and there are different degrees of Taliban-ness, right, when it comes down to it. That's what gets so difficult. And kind of what TC was talking about here is understanding who that is and be able to separate, because you know, if you apply the same tools to the entire movement, you know, whether that's somebody that's just sort of working with them because he was angry about something that coalition did in his village, or this is a senior level Taliban guy that goes over to Pakistan every year or never even leaves Pakistan, you know, or a Haqqani guy, you know, affiliated with them. Very different motives, very different ideologies, all that sort of stuff. So if you just say, okay, kill, capture all these guys, and you know, it's a finite number problem, you know, we say 20,000 or 30,000, we just got to do, that's the worst thing you can do, right? Because then, you know, every time you go in and you hit guys from different groups, you may just generate others, right? And so you end up with this sort of false mental model of it. That's not to say that amongst that continuum, there are people that should be targeted, right? And there's a lot of good work. West Point Combating Terrorism Center has done some fantastic work about networks and who you want to go after. Do you want to hit the top level guys? Do you want to hit the level 2 guys, level 3? And what are the effects on the network when you do that? But there are folks, and again, this is one of the sort of quasi-sensitive things to talk about, but there are specific points in the network that you can attack that you do need to kill or capture and do that, and that is why you see some pressure put there. But, you know, there are also cases where you can get people to reintegrate and pull over from the Taliban, from that movement, that are not as committed or for different reasons. And I will, to answer one of the other questions that you guys were talking about, the VSO, for you guys that don't know what the Village Stability Program or Village Stability Operations Program is a special operations-led program. The idea being that we're going to take a very small special forces team, 12 people, and it's just an illustration also whether that works, and then just something about the Taliban too. But you know, you take 12 to 18 coalition soldiers, you know, special operators, maybe with some conventional support, and they pre-negotiate with the village to say, okay, if we come in here, we clear this area, will you take us in as guests, as villagers, so that we can live here, you know, in the village with you and help you with security and some of your issues? And it's really, everyone gets wrapped around the idea of this Afghan local police, and that the only reason they're there is to generate this defense force. That's actually a side effect, right? The real reason they're there is to promote governance, right? And they do have some resources. They can do projects, they can do like that, but it's not to win a popularity contest, right? They're out there handing out lollipops to get people to like them, because let's face it, we talked about insurgency and what the Taliban is. It's not really about just making it popular or a good option to do that. This is all about control and coercion, right? That's really what it is. The Taliban, night letters, threats, the credible threat that you're going to kill me. You know, one, you know who I am, and if I work with the coalition guys, you'll be able to single me out, and two, that you actually be able to kill me or hurt my people that care to me. That's what drives a lot of this stuff. And so this addresses that by saying, we're going to go in here, we're going to embed in this village, we're going to help you with, you know, with your daily problems, but in exchange for these little bits of resources that we have, we need you guys to come together and form the beginnings of a little representative shura, the local grassroots type governance. I have some money here. I can, you know, work on some projects with you, but I need 3 or 4 of you to come forward and be leaders. And then I'm going to connect you with the next level above at the district center and try to do that. And in doing so, when we do that, I also need you to try to offer one of your sons up to help us guard this area. And what we've seen is that dynamic that can be achieved if the conditions are right on the ground there, is that you get one local guy that's truly local, right? Not a manufactured militia guy that's come from outside of the area, which we see in some areas, because they will try to manipulate this. But if it's actually from the village, right, and you can verify that, and one of the elders is offering up, that guy is going to be worth, you know, 100 external Tajik Afghan National Army guys that are hanging out there, because he grew up there, right? So he knows who's from there and who's not. And it addresses the idea of different elements of the Taliban, because you can drive a wedge between, when you do it right, you can drive a wedge between the local Taliban and sort of the Pakistani Taliban guys that come in. And that's the way they refer to them sometime in the field is, oh, local Taliban or Pakistani Taliban. You know, there is a perceived difference there. And I'll give you the quick example from this site that we saw in Oruzgan. These guys had gone in to a village in a valley that coalition forces have never been able to hold down. A place called Chutu Valley, right, in Uruzgan, right? And coalition forces had gone in here 3 times, right? Big sweep operations, but every time they'd stay there for 2 weeks and then they'd pulled out, right? And so this time, ODA using the VSO program, Operational Detachment Alpha Special Force Team negotiates with the village in this area and gets them to agree to let them come in. So this time they clear, but in advance they'd worked it out, and so they stay in the village. And through intelligence, we're here, we hear what the Taliban conversations are at the time that these guys come in. And at first, the Taliban, right, these are Pakistani Taliban, right? These are more senior guys that are in there kind of aggravate and raise these mobile columns and do operations. You hear their conversations, and they say, oh, don't worry about it. They've done this 3 times, over the last few years. They'll be gone in a couple weeks. Oh, okay, got it. And 2 weeks go by, right? Hey, what's going on? Not sure here. We're starting to run low on supplies. And they go and they hit up the Kuchi nomads, right, and get supplies from them. They're trying to stay there a little bit longer, but they're kind of stuck out away from the population, don't really have access to stuff. It's starting to get colder. They're not happy. A couple weeks, more weeks go by. Okay, forget it. Hey, we're packing up. We're going back across the border. We'll see them next year. And so you could see that there was a wedge. And then, with the team they weren't resting on their laurels. They were in there, but they were really trying to change the incentives, right, for why people would collaborate. And so, this very enterprising Special Forces engineer knew that trying to wait for a project, that was devised in Kabul would take, years sometimes. So he knew that the one thing these people in this village really, really wanted was a road to connect them with the district center. That was just down the river, the Helmand River. But the road had been destroyed by the Taliban. These people had been isolated for years and years. And so using CERT money, this flexible money that they had available to him on the ground, he requested a whole bunch of these big HESCO barriers that you could fill with sand, that they normally use for walls of bases. But he had the background and the knowledge to do this. And he started paying, he worked a deal with the locals where he would pay a little bit for the local crew. Remember, this is all people from the village where they could build this road, by hand, literally. And that's hard. I mean, with shovels to reconstruct this road along the river. And so they went and they did it. They did it over the course of a month and a half. He was supervising it. They built the thing and then they connected it and they did it. And everyone was in favor. And the village is, this is fantastic. It used to take us days to get to the district center. Now we can do it in a few hours. This is great. So they decided it was a really good thing to have this team there and to have these local defense. And so when I came in there, I sat in on the commissioning ceremony of this Afghan local police unit that had been there. And we're sitting there, and I'm standing next to the intelligence sergeant, actually a guy that I worked with before. And he goes, hey, yeah, you see that guy and that guy and that guy and that guy? I was like, yeah. He goes, well, those are local Taliban. He goes, they know it, and we know it. But they see what we've done here, and they're willing to play ball. And that's it. And we're just going to go from there. And so that's the dynamic. And that's, I think, more of what we need to see is having the nuanced understanding to know that Taliban isn't this monolithic entity, that there are different elements that we can possibly leverage to flip over and change the incentive structure that exists there. But then also, too, being savvy enough to be able to have the right mix of tools to go in there and do that at the grassroots level. So is that sustainable? Your question is that sustainable in the long term or not? I don't know. I mean, I'm a little pessimistic about it just because you see it work like that once and you go, oh, this is great. Let's do this. Let's reproduce this all over the country. And there's a tendency to grow it too fast and to do it where maybe you don't have special operations teams that are out there that have guys that have been trained in all this. And you just have people sort of, ready to hand out weapons to whoever the local volunteers would be for the, for this local defense group. And it could go the wrong way. And, it requires certain conditions. You have to have people on the ground that are willing to defend themselves, right, and are tired of the presence of the Taliban one, and that doesn't happen everywhere. So, if we start to drive those operations and say, well, we have 10,000 Afghan local police in these sites established now, I want 30,000 by the end of the year, and you're up in Kabul and you start putting points on the map, well, this is a really critical valley, this is one, and you can get into some dangerous things, right, because then now you're pushing things that don't necessarily have the grassroots level support to be able to succeed. And if you end up, with that kind of pressure, then you could end up producing militias and people that could be destabilizing that are not actually local defense forces, that are not geared towards promoting governance and could actually be malign actors that could work against the national security forces. So that's the line we have to walk on. I'm not saying it's a foregone conclusion it's going to go that direction, but we've got to be smart about it. And by no means is that, sort of the panacea to all of Afghanistan's ills. It's just one program.
Yeah, I come from a Peace Corps background, and a lot of this sounds like, plain old community development. And I'm just really curious about is there at this kind of local level more cooperation going on with the State personnel or State Department personnel? Is that actually happening, or?
I've actually worked with a lot of NGOs as part of my program. And they call it now democratic policing. Democratic policing incentives is something between State Department, UN. We call it unity of force. So it's where the Corps of Engineers, the conventional army troops, the Afghan troops, NGOs all come together, essentially working for this greater cause of democratic policing or some type of stability operations. But at the lower level, yes, there is a little bit more interaction only because, well, USAID now has, they're not the only ones, but there is a large incentive and a lot of representatives at the lower levels ready to and have funds for all kinds of stability operations and buildings of schools, of women's programs, of helping the policing and firefight. They have actually very similar and parallel missions at the ground level, and are actually funded for it and now going out and forward and actually employing all those, almost what used to be covered by the Corps of Engineers to now is also being covered by NGOs. In my experience, it came down to funding, and it came down to, okay, when was the proper time to go ahead and start bringing these programs? At the latter half of last year, $8 million was funded and actually sent forth, and all these programs started coming online. I don't have the privy to say how, I'm not with HTS right now to say, to gauge the perception or the effectiveness or the measure of that effectiveness of those programs. But I can tell you that as of late last year, $8 million went out just for those exact programs. And yes, they are on the ground.
Oh, I'm a little more pessimistic in this area. I think you run into a problem. The organizations exist here. Don't get me wrong, we did have a civilian surge, and there has been some effort on that front. But the fundamental problem you run into is that in some of the more dangerous areas, right, places where sort of my team was operating out of Kandahar and Helmand, very tough spots, there are some, legitimate force protection concerns for people. And so, while some of the civilian community can help in areas that are somewhat more secure, when you get to places where you really are trying to pull people over to your side and do this, but it's very dangerous and there's IEDs and there's ambushes, things like that, very often, even some of the most trained people, like the OTI guys from State Department Office of Transitional Initiatives, very sharp, savvy people, were just not allowed to get out to access some of those areas. And so you ran up against a problem of having a military guy do a lot of this stuff that didn't really have the training or experience to do it. And that's a problem. And I don't think we've quite figured that out yet. I think we've got it where it's a little bit safer, but in some of the areas where it's very difficult, we're trying to give military guys the job to do that. I get it, I understand it, but we haven't quite embraced it enough to say, okay, well, that's the way either civilians are going to start taking more risks, or we're going to say military guys in these areas are going to do it, but we're going to give them at least enough experience and training to do that. And we haven't quite done that. So you end up sometimes with, a military guy out there just kind of muddling through it and doesn't really have the experience. I know in some of the VSO special operations team that are out there, that OTI actually went and taught the district stability framework and some of the things that they use on that to generate the grassroots level governance. But that was, again, kind of initiative on the margins to say, oh, wow, we can't get civilians out here, so we're just going to have to turn to you. You're there. You're the only guy. We have no other, we'll give you this training and you can try to do it out there. But that's a problem that we're still trying to figure out, I think.
In my experience, the problem was sequencing. In clear whole build, we just kept having to clear. But we did, at one point in time, we had a USAID person on the ground, we had a Department of State, OTI, and we had USDA, actually, and they would have been a tremendous asset to use to kind of advise locals on, anything from bovine health to rice growing or whatever they needed. And in our largest battalion plans or brigade operations, we phase 2, hold, phase 3, build, bring in Allison from USAID, bring in the USDA guy, but just the way operations ran, we could never get to phase 3 in our province. But coming from the program that I'm in now, I was inspired by my time in Afghanistan to learn more about development, not knowing anything about development, but seeing that it's kind of key to low-intensity conflict in a lot of regards. There's a lot that's analogous there between that needs to happen between cooperation between security and development elements. Actually, we had to rely mostly on civil affairs personnel, the money that the special operations team could bring in, and hire local contractors because of the security situation. We just could not use USAID there. And I know the Kentucky National Guard has been particularly successful in fielding an agribusiness development team, where they actually, these guys are, all kinds of different military jobs, but they all come from agricultural backgrounds or have been trained in agriculture. And so on the other extreme of what Fernando was talking about, they have the security experience and training, and then they're going to give them the development training and hopefully go in there and kind of spur some economic development. So that's a very interesting initiative that I'm going to be following for as long as we keep fielding them.
Oh, we totally blew off one of the questions. Just 30 seconds on institutional memory. I think we're going to jettison counterinsurgency by and large, from most of the Army. I just get that sense. And if you just a main data point for you is sort of what our institutional educational system is doing right now, and for the signs are pointing to us kind of saying, well, we've drifted too far away from our core warfighting functions. We need to get back to that and focus on conventional warfare again. And I mean, I just went through sort of the mandatory majors training that you go through in the Army, and did that, so the official schoolhouse deal, and went through this several months of going through these different exercises. And our big culminating exercise event that we did right at the very end, 2-week long, big planning scenarios, everyone's role playing different roles, pretending you're like on a real staff and going through this thing. Guess what it was? Do you think it was some sort of stability counterinsurgency type thing, or had any component like that? No, right? No, it's worse. It was a fixed defense, dug-in defense against tanks, a division of tanks attacking using Soviet tactics. No exaggeration there. Like literally, they weren't actually Soviet tanks, but there was another country that was using Soviet tactics, and you were supposed to basically prepare this deliberate defense and do it. And that was what we invested, like the biggest amount of our time preparing for, was to do that. And I was actually angry at the end of it. Like they did the sensing session for feedback thing, and I raised my hand. I was like, well, what the heck are you guys doing? Why do we spend so much time on this? I got it. Okay, we could cover this in the course, but why do the culminating thing, the final sort of, you are prepared to go out and actually lead units in combat, like the last exercise they do to prepare these guys is something that we are, not at all likely to do, right? In the immediate future, right? And so why are we doing that kind of stuff? They said this is actually we tried doing some of that coin stuff for these things. But it was just kind of messy and it was hard and people didn't really understand. And they said there has been, a conscious decision. It's totally off the record, by the way. But there's a conscious decision by leadership at Fort Leavenworth that we have drifted too far away from our core warfighting, and we need to get back on that and focus. So I just get that. I get that sense. I think there are points of light, and that really talks about when TC was talking earlier about how some people are out there doing really good things, but it varies unit to unit. I saw the same thing floating around. Like you'd see some really great folks out there really trying to do good things, and in a lot of cases succeeding and making things happen, but it's just there's no systemic way to promote, to set these guys up for success, to figure out who the good people are at this and get them back into the problem and get them engaged, to build a continuity. It's just not there. So you end up with just this random, procession of people going into these jobs over there, and it's not institutionally protected, and the lessons they learn are not quite being captured and passed on to other people. So I'm not optimistic about that, unfortunately. And I think that's bad for national security in general, because it takes away from the capability for us to, the old cliche that, if all you have is a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail. I mean, it is kind of appropriate here, that if we do just have this capability, we won't be able to deal with these other kinds of threats that are out there. Right. Awesome.
No? Okay. I joined the Army originally as an M1 Abrams tanker, 60-ton tank. You can kill things from 2 miles away, and that was the flashiest, sexiest job that the Army could give me at that point in time. But once I realized that we weren't taking our tanks overseas, we weren't fighting the Soviets, we weren't doing all those things that we were training to do, I kind of went with the flow and decided to become an infantry officer and focused on some of the lighter aspects of infantry and the coin stuff, and that really kind of took hold of me. But I share, it's exasperating and perplexing that I think in Vietnam, part of the big problem was we never really admitted the kind of war we were fighting, even though low-intensity conflict, counterinsurgency is the norm, and the big, giant conventional wars are the aberration. A lot of people join the Army to be tankers or Apache pilots, and they have jobs in counterinsurgency, but it's not as cool or fun or simple to understand. There's not that standoff distance between you and the enemy. You might have to go to a jirga with the guy who was trying to kill you yesterday. People want to get back on their weapon systems, and I think probably this is speculation and off the record again, but at higher levels, there's people who want to sell us those weapon systems, and those weapon systems might not have a place in coin, and so it's definitely perplexing, frustrating, and I second everything Fernando just said.
Talked about interoperability problems between the Ohio National Guard and the Hungarians. I know about maybe officers who've been to ranger training or intelligence training in the U.S. So my question would be if that might have helped, or if you see a difference between officers who have been to training within NATO, where money has been invested to train them, and maybe officers or enlisted soldiers who haven't been, and maybe even in Zabul, where Romanians are. If you have had an experience with that, maybe you already referred to it. I don't know. It was off the record, but.
All the Hungarian officers on my team, which there were about 4 or 5 of them, they were either Army track or Marine track, and so almost all their schools were in America. But like we were just talking about, sometimes the schools don't prepare you the best for counterinsurgency. I know when I went through my 4-month infantry basic course at Fort Benning, Georgia. Counterinsurgency was something you did when you had the extra time, and the captain in charge kind of just freestyled about his experiences in Iraq or Afghanistan, and it was never really part of the schedule, or it was one day out of 120. I feel like our Hungarians, they were a lot more kinetically minded. They were more interested in doing the battle drills, not necessarily the cultural awareness, cultural sensitivity stuff. And I'm generalizing. There were some Hungarians who got it, just like there's some Americans who got it. Understood the coin aspects of what we were trying to do and the importance of the strategic implications of tactical actors, second and third order effects of your actions, and for the most part, though, I think it might be the majority in our force, and it might be the majority in their force. There's just a tendency to drive on those roads like you're in a bad action movie chase scene, or just be a little too heavy-handed because you want to use that DSK or that 50 cal machine gun or call in an airstrike. I think the tendency is just towards the kinetic, because it's what's comfortable, it's what you've trained on, it's what you know. That might just exist in a higher proportion among my partners at that time. But I think it also exists in a large proportion maybe in the U.S. forces.
I'll say I was a drill sergeant in the U.S. Army, so I can tell you through trade-off, what do we train young privates and soldiers to do? We train them to shoot, move, and communicate really well. So when, I call him Private Snuffy. So when Private Snuffy graduates, and he goes out to, to a combat zone, you ask him what his job is, he's going to tell you his specific job title, light wheel mechanic, and what are you here to do? I'm here to change, light vehicles and their tires, and okay, what else? Well, we're here to, he's going to tell you he shoots, moves, and communicates really, really well. He doesn't know anything about counterinsurgency because you've heard 3 people say, it's pretty complex stuff. I mean, you can, this requires a certain level of understanding of tactics and warfare, and we refer to it as warfare at the graduate level. So Private Snuff, who just graduated, doesn't really care about that, nor does he know about that because, well, his leaders might not know about that. Major Lujan just said he just graduated from a major school, and he wasn't taught anything about counterinsurgency, yet it is the focus and the drive and it is what we're involved in Iraq and Afghanistan. Except what type of formalized training is there in order to understand the environment you're operating in? As a drill sergeant, I can tell you there was 0. I have a hard enough time back then trying to train a soldier how to shoot, move, and communicate. Some of them did marginally well, some of them did really well. Just getting to that point, though, was a challenge. How am I supposed to teach a private or a sergeant who may be strategic in an actual counterinsurgency operation things that I can't even, that the major or the captain as his commander don't even understand?
It tells you what to do.
Yet, as we've seen, who has the biggest power over a counterinsurgency campaign? Is it the generals at the strategic level? No, we call it the strategic corporal. The strategic corporal at the ground level may break or make your operations. And as we've seen, unfortunately, they've broken a couple. And you're talking enlisted, or you're talking a lower line leader. There's a fundamental, once again, in a counterinsurgency, which your most important decisions and operations are not conducted by generals at the strategic level. It's done by the guys on the ground. They're your money makers. They're the ones who can make a difference. Yet, how much do they know about counterinsurgency? Zero. How much do their commanders know? Some, maybe. And if they know, do they embrace it? So within the Army, or within conventional forces, not just, I can only speak of the Army, the three of us are almost like an exception. And we were, in, as you can see, in exceptional positions. We try to influence as many as you can, but we're not the norm. Why is it not the norm? Well, because conventional forces are good at doing conventional forces stuff. The Army should go in, clear, say we're victorious in this battle, and move out and move on, and come back home, and nobody gets shot at anymore, and nobody takes any risks. Fortunately, counterinsurgency doesn't work like that. And it's arguably, learned from Vietnam or not. But right now, for some people, are their first impressions of a counterinsurgency what it really is. And you have your big proponents against it, as Major Lujan just told you, that at the large think tanks and your schoolhouses for a higher level of education within the Army, some are still saying that we're not doing counterinsurgency anymore because it takes away from what we should be doing and knowing as a conventional force as they shoot, move, communicate. So even within the force, you have to understand there's this dynamics of, is it coin, is it not? If it is, who's doing it? If it is, are the ones who's doing it, who knows about it? If they know about it, doing it, are they doing it well? There's a couple challenges we have to understand. And us as Americans, in general, and even as a force, as U.S. service members, if you pose a question, what is counterinsurgency? Unfortunately, a lot of us just don't know. So how can you conduct what you don't know?
I actually have a slightly different take on that, in that it's, I don't see the graduate level, I don't like that analogy as much because, well, a couple things. I mean, one, you tell that to a conventional soldier and say, hey, well, counterinsurgency is a graduate level school. It's almost like it's condescending to the idea of high intensity. That is also, I don't take away at all from that. That can be really complex, very difficult thing to do that you can't just sort of brush off. Instead, in fact, in order to be ready to do that kind of stuff, you do need to spend some time training and working on that, or those skills atrophy, right? So I don't know if it's necessary training everybody to be able to do counterinsurgency. I think it is more saying they're different jobs, in a lot of different ways. And so it's almost like the Ferrari versus the tractor thing, right? Like they're very good at what they do, but they're very different tasks. So you wouldn't, if you had a big field, a big muddy field you need to get across, you wouldn't take the Ferrari. Even the Ferrari is very impressive at what it can do. You're not going to take the Ferrari and put it in the field, right? And vice versa. And so, there has to be some sort of an acceptance amongst the larger military formations that not everybody really can do this stuff or signed up to do it or wants to do it or has any interest or can even be trained to kind of the level to be able to do these sorts of things, right? And to be able to say that rather than, and that's the issue, is that in the military writ large, we built, under General Shinseki and, some of the changes that happened when we modernized the military, for like it or not, we built this thing called a modular military, right? Where we said we're going to form all of our units into these packages that we can plug and play into any problem. Something happens in the world, all right, 18 hours wheels up, we're going to send them over there and they're going to be able to respond. There's a lot of advantage to that. You can deal with stuff, but there's also a cost, right? Because you're not going to develop any sort of real specialization or ability to do that. And it also assumes that everybody can plug equally well into different areas in the world. That's just not the case, right? In our community, and special operations community, it is, no, I'm going to focus on this region of the world. I'm going to learn the language and spend years doing this stuff so that I can go and I can be effective in these sorts of environments. I'm not saying that special operations are the only people that can do it, but I'm saying that it requires a little bit of that mindset and the ability to say that, well, some people can do this and some people cannot or have no interest in doing it, and that's fine. But let's make that distinction and say, okay, well, these people need some more training. We need to specialize. We need to take some of those institutional knowledge, pass it on to them, and get them involved in this region and have them do that and keep deploying to that region to build a capability there and not continue to pretend that this modular model can be effective going on into the future. So.
Well, We could talk about this for hours, and I would love to actually talk about this more, but we've run over time, and I would just like to thank our guests for taking the